have to distinguish between liquidity and solvency. Liquidity focuses on short-term viability of the business by addressing the question of whether or not they'll be able to meet immediately maturing short-term obligations. Insolvency, on the other hand, or solvency, on the other hand, looks at the longer-term viability of the business in terms of their going concern, assumption, and resiliency to sustain payments of debt obligations in the long run. Liquidity and solvency. So let's look at the balance sheets again. Usually, typically, in theory, ganyan na itsura ng balance sheet natin, asset, liability, and equity. As you saw earlier, some listed entities have a fair balance between sources of funding between liability and equity. Meron naman, like yung si Frutas, konti lang ang liability nila, but bulk of their funding is coming from equity. Also, there are companies, depending on the business model and their nature of operations, they rely heavily more on liabilities to fund their operations. So, example niya would be banks who are heavily leveraged in terms of their operations, maintaining only the capital they need for risk absorption purposes. Meron naman, especially the small businesses who have little to no liability and are purely equity. So mutual funds, if you're able to set up a mutual funds are purely equity, meaning pera ng mga investors. They have very little liabilities, usually just accruals for management fees, auditor fees, and other upkeep. But in substance, they're really funded mainly by equity. Ngayon, kung may ganyan, question, may ganito ba? A business purely funded by liability? Medyo mahirap ata yan. Some companies would have capital deficiencies which result in their liabilities being higher than asset. But that's another story. But usually I haven't seen a business that runs purely on other people's money. Pero kung meron at na-successful ka, ang galing mo, lakas ng loob mo, you're able to make money with little to no own capital. So, baka scam ka, pero wag naman sana. Okay. Now, of course, we need to understand the profile, the maturity profile of our assets liabilities. So, you can split our assets between current assets and non-current assets. Liabilities likewise, current liabilities and non-current liabilities. And dito papasok yung liquidity, wherein usually you would want more current assets, your current assets to outnumber your current liabilities in terms of amount, so that at least on record you can show na you have a lot of current assets that you can pay off current liabilities and still maintain operations. Now, at times, meron naman yung current assets, current liabilities equal. Pero if you look at this, masyado naman silang over-leveraged. So, yung kanila naman solvency naman ang question mo dito. Sure, liquidity mukhang kaya pa. Sakto lang. Pero long term, baka hindi na sustainable yan. Masyado ng inefficient yung liquidity operations mo such that you'll not have enough liquid assets to match for your current obligations and vis-a-vis your long-term ones. Plus, you look at the equity proportion, masyado na maliit. Over-leveraged na yung corporation. Finally, balancing nga yung liabilities mo, puro current naman. Tapos, yung current asset mo may not be enough. So, liquidity issues could be crystallized anytime soon. Now, liquidity risk, dalawa yan. Asset or price liquidity and funding liquidity risks. Asset liquidity talks about the assets ability, the assets propensity to be converted into cash. Now, the more liquid it is, the more that you can turn it into cash immediately and with the least possible cost. Funding liquidity, on the other hand, is the risk that we are not able to immediately service maturing obligations. So both of these, asset liquidity risk, funding liquidity risk, us as corporate treasurers, we must be cognizant, especially of funding liquidity risk. But for asset liquidity, we are involved as well, being our goal is to safeguard resources. We also have to make sure that we maximize uh, the realizability of our assets. Some indicators of asset risk, asset liquidity risk, access to markets, kung meron bang buying or selling market. Yung admin namin pag magbebenta ng equipment, anong proof natin na may market tayo? Sir, nagpunta po kami sa Lazada tsaka Shopee. Yan po yung market namin. So, o nga naman, objective, may screenshot pa sila. Ito po yung seller ng buyer ng Shopee tsaka seller ng Shopee sa Shopee. So, an indicator of asset liquidity would be the availability and access to markets for which we can unload the asset and convert them into cash. Another indicator would be the economic situation. Baka naman mamaya, we're already pressed for funds. So, nagiging depressed na yung pricing natin because it's already a fire sale. So, we have to be cognizant of those situations. And finally, the assets current state. Baka naman mamaya, on the record, we see that the value is still high, but when we see the actual physical state of the asset in question, it's already way past its economic useful life. So we have to also not just rely on the records that we have as corporate treasurers, be as well cognizant of the actual state of our assets. Kung intellectual property yan, we need to be able to have an understanding as to its viability and even our rights over those intellectual property. Funding liquidity risk indicators, ito na papasok yung mga common ratios that we monitor in the balance sheet, such as the liquid asset ratio, wherein we see the proportion of liquid assets over the total assets. So madali siyang i-infer based on the financial reports that we have. Current ratio naman is the proportion between current assets and current liabilities. So typically 1.5 to 2, yan yung range that we would normally we want to see. Usually kapag 1.5 to 2, meaning even if you pay off all your immediately outstanding obligations, you still have enough current assets left to continue with the operation. Yun yung logic behind. Asset test is similar to current ratio except walang inventory. You don't include the merchandise inventory. You want to see how quickly, ito yung quick ratio or asset test ratio, how quickly you can really immediately pay off maturing obligations. Solvency risk indicators, on the other hand, you look at the long-term prospect of the company. You focus on your ability to cover your debt servicing. So, ito, ang ginamit na formula is net income divided by total liability. Some would use the earnings before tax or EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation and amortization. So, but in my formula, nagamit ko net income. But the point here is that you look at your operating income's ability to cover your debt servicing. Now, the most common right now being used is debt to equity ratio, which is the ratio between your credit financing and your equity financing. It tells you how leveraged you are financially in terms of your equity's ability to cover for your liabilities. Finally, one of the more common will be interest coverage ratio, meaning how many times will your current operation be able to cover your interest expense servicing. So it's the ratio between EBITDA and interest expense. So the higher it is, the more likely that you'll be able to pay off your interest expense.